Well, good morning, everybody. Pastor Steve here. Thank you for being with me today for our devotion and our Bible reading plan at First Baptist. We are in the book of Acts, chapter 8, and there is so much in this chapter we could talk about. And I do want to share with you a few thoughts, but the big focus for me in this chapter is how God sometimes brings a lot of really good things out of some bad things. Now, he doesn't do that every time, but he does sometimes bring something good out of bad. When does he do it? When our focus and our faith is right. He'll bring something good. If our focus and our faith are not right, he may not bring something good out of the bad. It may just be all bad. Look with me at the beginning of chapter 8, verses 1 and following. Says Saul was in hearty agreement with putting him to death, talking about the stoning of Stephen in the previous chapter. And then it says, on that day, a great persecution began against the church in Jerusalem. So with the stoning of Stephen, it was like the door was open to persecute believers in Jerusalem. And they were all scattered, the believers in Jerusalem being persecuted, then scattered throughout the regions of Judea and Samaria, except the apostles. Some devout men buried Stephen. Then in verse 3, Saul began ravaging the church. Notice the strength of that word, like a wolf, a lion, ravaging the church, entering house after house. Going house to house, dragging off. Listen to that word, dragging off. Not just compelling them to come up, dragging them off. Men and women. And he would put them in prison. And therefore, in verse 4, those who had been scattered because of the persecution in Jerusalem went about, they spread out to the areas of Judea and Samaria, another country to the north, but they went about preaching the word. And he goes on in this chapter to talk about the growth of the church. Now, this intense period of persecution of God's people, of Jesus' followers in the city of Jerusalem was awful. It was bad. But I want you to notice that God brought good out of it, because these believers scattered from Jerusalem to other parts of the country of Judea, as well as into the neighboring country or region of Samaria. Now, the good that came was that more and more people were saved and the church grew. Churches were planted in new areas, not just because they scattered, but because they scattered with the right focus and with faith. And as they left Jerusalem due to the persecution and went to these other places, they shared the gospel in those new places they were scattered to. And as they shared the gospel in these new places, more people were saved and more churches were started. And so God brought good out of the bad, because their focus was not, woe is me, why is this bad happening? Their focus was, as they scattered, they kept talking about Jesus. They kept doing evangelism. They had faith. And so God will bring good from bad if you keep your focus and your faith. And maybe this persecution is what it took to get them to leave Jerusalem and begin taking the gospel elsewhere, as Jesus had told them to do in chapter 1 of Acts, immediately before his ascension. You'll be my witnesses in Judea, Samaria, uttermost parts of the earth. Maybe it took persecution to get them to obey God. Just something to think about. Now, a couple of real quick notes. In verse 5, it talks about Philip going. Notice it says, Philip went down to the city of Samaria and began proclaiming Christ to them. Now, usually when we talk about going down, someplace we think about going down, going south. Samaria, though, is actually north of Jerusalem. So you're going down, but you're going up, because remember, in the Bible, because Jerusalem, and in particular the temple, are the center of the Jewish faith, you always go down from Jerusalem when you leave it and go anywhere. It doesn't matter if you're traveling north, east, west, south. You're always going down when you leave Jerusalem, and you're always going up when you're traveling to Jerusalem. It doesn't matter the direction you're coming from. You're always going up to Jerusalem. So that's the reason in verse 5 it says Philip went down to Samaria even though he was traveling north. And then one last point. Philip is sent by the Lord after preaching in Samaria out into the desert along one of the main highways that people traveled on their way down to Egypt. And he encounters an Ethiopian government official riding in a chariot, reading from the scroll of Isaiah. And he climbs up in the chariot, shares the gospel, explains what he's reading there in Isaiah. And the man, this Ethiopian, becomes a believer, and Philip baptizes him. And you see that in the last half of this chapter. And I point that out because once you get over to chapter 13, the book of Acts focuses on the Apostle Paul and his missionary journeys in the areas today we would think of as primarily Turkey and Greece. We also know that he made his way to Rome, and there's hints that he made his way to Spain. And those are European countries, but we don't have much in the book of Acts about the gospel spreading toward Asia or toward Africa. This is a story of an Ethiopian, a nation in Africa. And if you go to Africa today, there is an historic Christian church, believers in the country of Ethiopia. I wish the Bible told us more about the spread of the gospel to Africa. We know that in the Roman Empire, the three largest cities in the Roman Empire, two of them were in Africa. One was the city of Rome. The other was the ancient city of Alexandria in Egypt. And the third one was Carthage in Tunisia. So in church history, for the first several centuries, Alexandria in Egypt was as well as Carthage, really, but Alexandria in particular was one of the four main centers of Christianity in the first several centuries, along with Rome and a couple of other places. And some of the great leaders of the church, some of the great theologians and writers, such as Augustine or Augustine, depending on how you want to pronounce his name, Cyprian and Tertullian, they were Africans. And so there is a great history of the church for the first few centuries in Africa that the Bible doesn't tell us a whole lot about. There are clues and hints, and I just point that out because sometimes, because we don't know church history real well, we become a little bit too European-centric in our thinking. We become, if we're going to be honest with ourselves, a little bit too white in our thinking when it comes to theology, not understanding that Jesus was a Jew. He was not European. Jesus was a Jew. He was not white. And the church spread and grew rapidly in Africa, especially northern Africa, in Egypt and Ethiopia, just like it did in Turkey and Greece and Italy. And so knowing some of that history and making ourselves not look at everything just only through the lens of Europe can be very, very helpful in understanding the work of God in this world. So that's just some historical stuff I wanted to point out. But what spoke to me spiritually and in my own life was what I talked about at the beginning, that God sometimes, if we keep our focus and our faith right, God can use something bad to bring about something good. Doesn't mean the bad was good. It's not. But if we keep our focus and our faith right, God will use it to bring about something good. So let's always trust God no matter what happens in our lives. Hey, God bless you, and I'll see you tomorrow as we look at chapter 9.